Well, thank you for joining us. And I first and foremost, I want to thank the Embassy of Japan for graciously hosting and sponsoring what will be the first of several, actually 6 seminars that we're going to do on beverages from Japan. But before we get started, and Timothy begins his presentation, what I'd like to do is introduce from the Embassy of Japan, Counselor Kuriyishu, and forgive me for butchering your name, but welcome. And I understand we'd love to have you say a few words to the group before we get started.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us. Well, actually, my name is Kuroishi. My name is Kuroishi Ryo, Counselor for Public Affairs at the Embassy of Japan here in Washington, D.C. Well, I'm not good at lighting, so if it looks a little bit dark, I'm sorry for that. Well, first of all, allow me to say how delighted and thrilled I am to have the opportunity to take part in this wonderful webinar series. And I would like to thank Capital Wine School, especially Mr. J. Yeomans and Ms. Caroline Hermans for partnering with the embassy. And I would also like to thank you, our audience, for your interest in Japanese sake. We have so much respect for your knowledge and experience in the food and wine industry. And we are honored that you would take time to learn more about these signature Japanese alcoholic beverages. Well, throughout the course of this series, we will introduce and dive deeper into the world of Japanese sake, shochu, and whiskey, helping to deepen an understanding of their characteristics, quality, and subtleties, and discuss how best to go about serving, mixing, and pairing them with a meal. By the way, I myself have a strong interest in local wine and food. My experiences living in Spain and Italy, as well as the US throughout the course of my career, have given me a renewed appreciation for wine, leading me to complete WSET Level 3 and to start my journey towards completing my diploma. So I too am looking forward very much to this series and to learning more about Japanese sake alongside all of you. Notably, food and wine are such wonderful avenues for cultural exchange. Going forward, our hope is that more and more people will have every opportunity to enjoy this unique exchange of cultures and taste of Japan as part of their dining experience, whatever the settings may be. For tonight's introductory section on Japanese sake, we are excited to be joined by Mr. Timothy Sullivan. And I'd like to take a moment again to thank Capital Wine School for all of their generous support and to thank everyone involved who helped organize this series. We are very much appreciative of this opportunity to collaborate and hope that all of you find tonight's and all of our upcoming webinars engaging and informative. Thank you very much again, and please enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kuriishi. So I just want to take a few minutes because Timothy Sullivan, our speaker tonight, is a very accomplished educator and speaker on sake. And in the original invite, I sent out some information about his background, but I think it merits a little discussion. So Timothy, in 2005, he started Urban Sake, which was the first blog and website on sake in the US. In 2007, he was awarded the Sake Samurai by the Japanese Sake Brewers Association. He is a global brand ambassador for the Hakai-San Brewery. He's also an instructor for the Sake School of America. He's a WSET Level 3 instructor. So again, you know, his credentials are far and wide. He's also one of the founding members of the American Sake Association. And he's currently the host of a blog on sake, which is called the Sake Revolution. Really encourage you to subscribe to that. His certifications are equally impressive. He started with the Sake School of America. He became a sake advisor in 2012. In 2013, he became a sake professional. He became an international sake sommelier in 2014. In 2016, and I want to ask him more about this because this is fascinating to me, but in 2016, he was granted a scholarship of sorts by the Japanese sake brewers to go study how to brew sake in Japan for a year. He spent almost a year there. He's also a certified Shochu advisor through the Sake School of America, and he holds a sake diploma and a sake scholar certifications as well. So, I think he's, it's probably embarrassing for me to go through these awards and these accomplishments, but I think somebody who spent this much time studying something so fascinating as sake, I think it should be pointed out. So I'm going to turn it over to Timothy. I think everybody is anxious to hear your presentation, and thank you for being here, Timothy. Before I do turn it over, one last thing is please hold your questions to the end. Feel free to put your questions in the comment box, the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. So thank you so much, Timothy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate it. And that was quite an introduction. I think you hit my whole resume there. I am very, very happy to be here with all of you tonight. And before I go any further, I just want to make sure that everyone can see and hear me all right. If you can, there's a little reactions button at the bottom. If you can give me a thumbs up and let me know that you can hear me all right, that would be great. And please feel free to put any questions in the chat. I'm going to save 10, 15 minutes towards the end to make sure that we address everyone's questions. As Jay said, I am a sake samurai, and I've been in the sake business for about 15 years. I did have the chance to live in Japan for 1 year in 2016, and I did a 12-month sake brewing internship at Hakai-San Brewery. And some of the photos I'm going to show you tonight are actually from my time working at the sake brewery. So you're going to see behind the curtain inside the sake brewery. And today's focus is really going to be a Sake 101, an introduction to sake. Everything you need to know to have a basic and solid understanding of sake. We're going to start with sake ingredients, sake production process. We're going to do a tasting of 3 sakes. And if you were able to get the samples, you should have the samples with you. If they're gently chilled, about white wine temperature, that's absolutely perfect. And all you need to taste them is just a wine glass of some kind. That's all we really need. No special glassware is needed. So if you want to get those things prepared, we're going to do our tasting about halfway through the presentation. So I'll try not to make you wait too long before we get to taste the sake. Okay, now to move on, I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. All right. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. That is our welcome slide. Now, before we go any further, I want to teach all of you one word that I think not enough people know, and it's really important for the world of sake. Now, we're going to learn a little bit of Japanese, and this will be quick, I promise, but this word I think is so important for people studying sake. It's really important to know about. Now, the Japanese character that you see here on the screen is the Japanese character for sake. This character has 2 pronunciations based on the context. You can say sake or you can say shu. It sounds just like the shoe on your foot. So sake or shu are 2 ways to say this. And the meaning of this, if you say sake in Japanese, the meaning of this is actually alcohol in general. So if you go into a bar in Japan and ask for sake, You're asking for alcohol and I don't know what you're going to get. You might get wine, whiskey, or beer, or sake. There's a word that the Japanese use to describe what we in the West call sake. Now, this character is a Japanese kanji character, and they started out as representations of physical objects. And if you can stretch your imagination, and do you see the jug with the 3 splashes coming out? That is the origin of this kanji character for sake. And this jug is actually a vintage Japanese, more ancient sake jug. So this was the true origin of the word sake, was a physical representation of the jug that it was brewed and served in. These kanji characters represent Japan. It's pronounced Nihon in Japanese, and it means the origin of the sun. And this is Japan. And if we put it all together, we have the important word I want to teach you, Nihon Shu. So Nihon Shu literally means the native alcohol of Japan, or the original alcohol of Japan. So if you go to Japan and you want what we in the West call sake, you want to know this word Nihon Shu. This is really important, and I really love to teach this word to people because this is the true way to say sake in Japanese. All right, moving on, let's define what sake is. Is sake a wine? Is it a beer? Is it a spirit? Which of these do you think it is? Well, this is actually a trick question. Let's look at what sake is not. So sake is not a wine. You very often hear people say the words rice wine together. That is kind of a lazy shorthand for describing what sake is. If you look up the definition of wine, it's alcohol fermented from fruit. And of course, with sake, we have no fruit involved. So we don't really meet the definition of wine. Some people think because it comes from a grain, it might be a beer. But beer is defined as alcohol that's fermented from a malted grain. We usually, in the definition as well, as hops added for flavoring. And we do not malt the grain to get sake, so we don't fit in the definition of beer either. And some people think that sake is distilled like a vodka, and sake is not distilled. Sake uses a natural fermentation process to make its alcohol. So it's not a spirit either. The answer is sake is not a wine, beer, or spirit. It is a unique form of alcohol, and it's in a category all its own. So the definition is sake is fermented alcohol made from rice. One thing that is similar to beer is that sake uses a 2-step fermentation process. And those 2 steps are the conversion of starch in the rice into sugar, and then sugar into alcohol. So if you're familiar with if you're familiar with beer production, you know that you have this 2-step production process. But sake is different from beer, and there's something that makes it very, very unique. What makes sake unique? Well, it's how this starch to sugar and sugar to alcohol conversion happens. So what's unique is that the starch to sugar and sugar to alcohol, these 2 processes happen in the same tank at the same time. And in the world of sake, we refer to this as multiple parallel fermentation. So starch to sugar, sugar to alcohol, it's going on at the same time. No other alcohol is made in this way. So this is something that's really unique to sake. And this multiple parallel fermentation allows the yeast to have a constant supply of food as the fermentation period progresses. So we can get very high levels of alcohol through natural fermentation in the world of sake. We can get up to 20–21% alcohol through fermentation alone. And that is also some of the highest alcohol levels you can achieve through fermentation. And that's because of this very unique process we use in the world of sake. So next, let's look at what the ingredients are. We have 4 main ingredients that we're going to look at: rice, water, yeast, and koji. Let's take a quick moment and talk about each of these. So water is the first ingredient. And when you pick up a bottle of sake, 80% of what's in that bottle is water. So water has a big impact in the overall feel and nuance of the sake. In general, you can think of there being two types of water in Japan, hard water and soft water, based on how mineral rich the water source is. The water source you see here is a mountain stream in Niigata. This is considered exceedingly soft water, very low minerality. But other parts of Japan have harder water, much more mineral rich. The mineral rich water is going to produce more full-bodied, more robust sakes, and the snowmelt, very light, soft waters are going to produce cleaner and lighter sakes. The next ingredient, of course, is yeast. And those of you familiar with wine and beer know the role of yeast. Yeast is a microorganism that eats sugar and gives off alcohol and CO2. So the yeast is really our engine of fermentation, and this is how the alcohol is produced. In the world of sake, the yeast variety that's selected has a big impact on the aromatics of the sake. So different yeast profiles are going to produce different aroma profiles in the sake. So that's one of the primary considerations the brewer is going to have when they select which variety of sake yeast they're going to use. Now, the next ingredient is probably the most unfamiliar to people outside of Japan, and this is koji. Koji is actually a type of mold. And some people freak out when they learn that there's mold in sake, but this is a perfectly safe, healthy, delicious, friendly mold. What we do with this mold, it's yellowish greenish in color, as you can see here. We actually sprinkle this mold onto steamed rice, and we grow, or we propagate the mold onto the rice grains. This molded rice is then an ingredient in sake that we call Koji rice. And since most people have not seen it before, I actually have a few photos to show you of what this actually looks like up close. When you say we put moldy rice into the sake, that sounds pretty scary for most people. So I just want to show you what we're dealing with here. So this is sake rice that has been steamed, and this gets sprinkled with the koji mold. And after about 24 hours, you have something that looks like this. And you can see the little fuzzy bits starting to come up on the rice and grow. And this is where the mold is starting to propagate and take hold. After about 48 hours, this is a 2-day process to grow the mold on the rice. We have finished koji that looks like this. It has kind of a fuzzy coating on the outside, but the mold has also dug down into the grain itself. Now, why on earth are we putting this molded rice into the sake mash? Well, koji has a very special property that we need to make sake. Koji mold gives off an enzyme that breaks down starch into sugar. So we use this koji rice to provide this enzyme into the mash. And that enzyme acts like a little scissors, and it cuts down the starch molecules into sugar molecules. So this allows us to break down starch into sugar. And if we didn't have this koji mold, we wouldn't get that breakdown of the unfermentable starches in rice. So this is a key ingredient, and about 20% of the rice used for the whole batch is going to be this koji molded variety. All right? Now, the final ingredient is the one that everybody knows about, and that is sake rice. If we look at sake rice a little closer, like you see here, you can see that the rice grains are a little bit pudgier, a little bit fatter than you may be used to for types of eating rice that you may have. For example, jasmine rice or something like that. This is a Japanese strain of rice that is grown specifically for making sake. There's about 100 varieties of premium sake rice. Now, this sake rice has a structural difference to it that is different from eating rice in Japan. So there's a unique structure to the grain itself. And let's look at what that's all about. So if you were to slice open a grain of sake rice, you would see the starch in the grain concentrated in the core of the rice grain. I sometimes tell people to think of this like a hard-boiled egg. You know, you've got your egg yolk in the middle and your egg white on the outside. So in this case, the starch in the grain would be the egg yolk, and the egg white would be the fats and the proteins of the rice grain. Those are actually the more nutritional part. That would be more towards the outside of the rice grain. And here you have a picture of what the rice looks like when it's been milled a little bit. Can you all see that little starchy core? There's a little opaque area towards the center of the grain. That is the starchy core in the sake rice. And the reason that is so important is that it allows brewers to mill the rice and isolate that starch. So we can remove the majority of the fats and proteins on the outside, and we can isolate the starch in the center. So this is one of the key reasons that sake rice is a specific strain of rice that's grown only for making sake, and it has this starchy core. In Japanese, this starchy center is called shinpaku, which means the white heart. So it's the heart or center of the rice grain. This picture shows you the milling machines that they use to polish the rice down to different sizes. The rice is dropped on a milling stone as it spins, and it takes about 48 hours in this machine to go from 100% grain down to 50% remaining. Here's a picture of the millstone that's inside. The rice is going to cascade over the side of this as it's spinning and get scraped a little bit and then get dropped again and again and again. And this process is the first step in sake making. And the more you polish the rice, the smaller the grain gets and the more premium your sake is going to be. And last slide about the rice. So this is a side-by-side comparison of sake rice that has been milled down to 35% remaining, or sake rice that is 100% grain. So here you can see a very clear side-by-side comparison of different remaining sizes. And if you look closely, it's a little bit hard in this, probably for you on your screen, but there is a little starchy core right in the middle of each of these sake rice grains. And you can see a little opaque center in there. That's the starchy core. One final note about rice milling. When we talk about these milling percentages, we always talk about what's remaining in the grain, never what's been taken away. So a 35% rice milling ratio is 35% remaining. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about, we're going to take about 5 minutes and talk about sake classifications. And I think as someone who's learning about sake, understanding the sake classifications for me is one of the best pieces of knowledge you can have. So if there's one takeaway from tonight, I really want it to be the next 5 minutes when we talk about sake classifications. So much of the different way that sakes are organized on menus and shelves in supermarkets is built off of this classification system. And I think that it's very empowering to know this. So I want to take a few minutes and explain the basic classification system for sake. So the first thing you need to know is that there's only, at the highest level, there's really only 2 kinds of sake. So every sake you ever drink in your whole life is going to fall into one of 2 primary categories. And those 2 categories are based on what the ingredients of the sake are. So we have one group of sake called the pure rice style of sake. And the ingredients for that are the ingredients we talked about already: rice, water, yeast, and koji. So if your sake only contains those 4 ingredients, you have what's called a pure rice style sake. But there is another category of sake, and it has an additional ingredient. Some sakes are lightly fortified with distilled alcohol. So if you have distilled alcohol added to your sake, you have what's known as the alcohol added style. Very simple. You may be wondering, why on earth would you add alcohol to alcohol? Why are some sakes fortified and others are not? Well, in Japan, during the Second World War, there was actually a law that all sake must be fortified. During the war, they did this to produce more volume of alcohol with less rice. But for modern premium sake, they discovered that when they add a small amount of distilled alcohol, they can coax out different textures, aromas, and this helps dissolve additional rice compounds, and you get additional flavors that you don't get from the pure rice style. So from this law that existed in the mid-20th century, this left us with this system of some being fortified and some being not. I don't want anyone to think for a second that one style is considered superior to the other in quality. Some people hear pure rice and they think, oh, that has to be better because it's pure. But actually, the alcohol added style is used for many, many premium styles of sake and can be absolutely delicious. The majority of the sakes that win the new sake award every year in Japan are the alcohol added style. So there's no shame in using the alcohol added style. They're just stylistically different. And we're going to taste tonight 1 alcohol added and 2 pure rice styles. So you can get a little bit of a sense for what the difference in texture, aroma, and mouthfeel is for these sakes. Okay, so the first thing that defines the classifications is what the ingredients are. Now we're going to cross this with how much the rice is milled. We talked a moment ago about the rice being polished down or milled down, and you can do that to different percentages remaining. So if we, across the top of this chart, imagine the universe of rice milling from whole grain all the way down to 1% remaining. So the first decision a brewer needs to make when they make a sake is, how much am I going to polish my rice? If you leave a fair amount of the grain intact, let's say 80% remaining, that's going to be a more affordable style of sake because you have a lot of raw material left, but there's a lot of those fats and proteins still in there because you haven't polished very close to the starchy core. So that's going to give a more ricey, robust flavor. Now, if you polish the rice grain down to a very small size, let's say 40 or 35% remaining, you've isolated a lot of that starchy core, you've gotten rid of a lot of the fats and proteins, and you can coax out additional non-ricey flavors out of a sake that's milled to that size. You can get fruity flavors or lactic flavors or a different variety of flavors. It's not going to be so influenced by the fats and proteins. So the smaller you mill the rice grain, the more expensive and the more premium the sake is going to be. Now, let's look at the pure rice style. Within that area, we have 3 grades that we need to know about. So there's 3 grades, and they all have this word Jumai in them. And Jumai literally means in Japanese, pure rice. So if you see this word Jumai anywhere in the name of your sake or the description of your sake, you know that it's a pure rice style and you know what the ingredients are. Now, to sell your sake as Jumai, there is no milling requirement on the rice. It's just an ingredient requirement. So no added alcohol allowed, rice water, yeast, and koji only. Now, if you've polished your rice down to 60% or less remaining, you qualify for the next grade up, which is Jumai Daigenjo, okay? And this is considered a step up, a little bit more premium. I'm not saying higher quality. There are delicious, wonderful qualities along all these grades, but it is considered more premium. Now, if you polish your rice down to 50% or less remaining, you qualify for what we call super premium. This in Japanese is Jumai Daigenjo. So dai means big in Japanese. So this is the big ginjo or the super premium. So a very small percentage of sakes that are made in Japan reach this quality level. So this is more expensive and more rare. So Jumai, Jumai Ginjo, Jumai Daigenjo. These are the 3 grades of pure rice style sake. Now let's move on to those alcohol added styles. There's also 3 premium grades. So at the very bottom of this chart, you have something called Futsushu. So Futsushu is a type of, there's that shu, remember, from the sake kanji lesson, shu, Futsushu. Futsu means ordinary or regular. So this is ordinary or regular sake, what we in the West would call table sake. This is not premium. It is fortified with alcohol. And the rules and regulations around Futsushu are not the same as premium sake. The reason it's on the chart at all is because Futsushu makes up about 70% of all the sake produced in Japan. So the vast majority of what's made in Japan is more mass market, more factory made, a non-premium table sake. But once you move past that, the entry to premium for the alcohol added style is called honjozo. Now honjozo has a milling requirement of 70% or less remaining. The next level up is easy to remember. You just leave off that word Jumai and you've got Ginjo, 60% or less remaining. And then Daigenjo is 50% or less remaining. Again, just leave off the word Jumai. Okay, so these top 6 categories are the classifications. And if you ever come across sake on a menu or in a liquor store, you're going to be seeing these names. And now I hope you have a better understanding of what the different classifications mean as far as ingredients and rice milling go. All right. Now, you are all very good and sat through the lecture part. We're going to talk now about the sake tasting. So if you have your samples ready to go, we're going to go ahead and pour those into our glasses and taste through these sakes. So we're going to be tasting 3 sakes from 3 different grades. So we have a Honjozo to start. Sake number 2 is a Jumai Daigenjo. And sake number 3 is a Jumai Daigenjo. So we have a representative from each grade, and we have a representative of the 2 different styles. All right. So the first sake, I want you to go ahead and pour sake number 1, if you haven't already. Go ahead and get that into your wine glass. And I'm going to introduce this brewery. This is the Hakai-San Brewery. On the left, you can see a picture of the brewery building where the sake was made. And on the right, you can see the location of the prefecture or the state where this is located. It's located in Niigata, Japan. This is actually where I lived and worked for 1 year. So I worked in this building for a long time, and I'm very familiar with Hakai-San Brewery, and it's very nostalgic to look at this picture. Now you see the steam coming out of the building. I know exactly when this photo was taken because they steam the rice in the morning from around 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. So I know if there's steam coming out of the building, I know exactly the time that this photo was taken. So let's take a look at this sake. And this is Hakai-san Tokubetsu Honjozo. Now I introduced this word Honjozo, but not this term Tokubetsu. What does that mean? Well, Tokubetsu just means special. And there's no regulation or rules around how breweries can use this word. But in most cases, this is a term that is applied to a sake classification when the milling rate has gone much, much smaller than you would expect. So if anyone can think back to our chart, what is the minimum milling requirement for Honjozo? So for Honjozo, to qualify for that grade level, normally you mill to 70% or a little bit less. And the milling rate for this sake is 55% remaining. So instead of 70, the brewers took it all the way down to 55 remaining. So that is a very small, luxurious milling size for this grade of sake. So that's why they've chosen to call this their special kind of reserve Tokubetsu Honjozo. A few words about the stats that are listed here. The rice milling rate, of course, that's the amount remaining of the rice that's been used. This number SMV. SMV stands for sake meter value. And this is a rough measurement of how sweet or dry the impression of the sake might be. Plus numbers on the scale are considered drier, so higher is drier. Negative numbers on the scale might be considered sweeter. And it's really a measurement of the density of the sake compared to water, with 0 being the same as water. So plus numbers generally have a bit more alcohol forward content and they are a little bit thinner than water, so you get a drier impression. So +4, if I saw that, that would lead me to think I might expect something very lightly dry. The alcohol percentage is 15.5, and we have 2 rices listed for this sake. Gohyaku Mangoku, which is listed as the Koji Rice, so that's the rice that they use to make that 20% of molded rice, and Todoroki Wase, which is the Kakemai. Kakemai is the starch component. So that's the 80% of rice used that is used to convert starch into sugar. So the Kojimai is the molded rice and the Kakemai is the starch component. So now that we've reviewed the stats, let's go ahead and have a smell of this sake and a taste. So first let's give it a little swirl and give it a smell. Now the Niigata region is known for mountains, heavy snow, and exceedingly soft water. So this soft water is generally translating into drier, lighter, cleaner styles of sake. Some sakes made with Niigata water, I call them magic water because the sakes are so light and clean, they taste very water-like. this sake, we also want to look for the finish. You know, how crisp and clean is that finish going to be? So let's go ahead and give it a taste. So in the aroma, you may notice like gentle hints of steamed rice. Not much in the way of fruitiness or lactic characters going on here. Very rice forward, but very restrained. So the aroma overall is quite restrained. The flavor on the palate is ricey, dry, relatively clean. There's a bit of warmth and a very, very crisp finish. So the finish on this sake is quite short. This is very indicative of the local Niigata regional style, regardless of brewery. They really focus on what they call tanrei karakuchi, or clean, crisp, and dry sakes. All right, so that's our first sake. This is, again, a representation of what would be considered a lighter, drier, cleaner sake in Niigata. Now we're going to move on to another part of Japan. We're going to Ryujin Shuzo. This is in Gunma Prefecture. So Gunma Prefecture is smack dab in the middle of the main island of Japan, as you see here. And it is a landlocked prefecture, so there's no access to the Sea of Japan or the Pacific Ocean. And it is known for having some mountains, and it's a transitional place between the mountains of Niigata into the plains of Tokyo. And this is a picture of Ryujin Shuzo. And let's take a look at the sake that they have given us for today. This is Oze no Yukidoki. So Oze no Yukidoki, that is the brand name of this sake. Jumai Daigenjo is the classification. That's that middle grade of premium for the Jumai styles. And then Omachi is the rice variety. So Omachi is a really interesting rice variety. I'm going to go ahead and pour my sample number 2. Omachi is a rice that is often called the grandfather of sake rice because it is not a hybrid of any other strains of rice. It is a naturally found, naturally occurring sake rice. And it has a lot of fans in Japan. It's one of the top 5 or 6 premium sake rices used. And it has a very unique depth of flavor to it that comes across in a lot of sakes. So this is a Jumai Daigenjo grade. The rice milling here is 55%. The SMB is +5, so just a tick drier than the previous one. And the alcohol percentage is 17%. So this is a higher alcohol than our Honjozo. And the Kake and Kojimai, the 2 types of rice, are both Omachi. So this is this rice uses only one strain of, this sake uses only one strain of rice, this Omachi rice. So let's go ahead and give this a little swirl and a smell as well. So you may notice a bit more of a pronounced aromatics going on here compared to the Jumai Daigenjo, the Honjozo. I've had these in separate cups so I can go back and forth. I find that doing side-by-side comparisons is one of the best ways to learn about sake. When you calibrate your nose and your palate for different styles of sake, it's a wonderful way to learn and understand what different meanings are. When you say dry in sake, what does that mean compared to wine? So this one has a more pronounced aroma. Very, very deep aromatics and a little bit of fruitiness and a little bit of riciness. This is going to give us a bit more complexity. Let's give it a taste and see if we can pick up on that complexity on the palate as well. Definitely. So compared to sake number 1, you may notice a lot more depth of flavor, more umami, a little bit more robustness, more layered flavor. There's riciness there. There's a wonderful umami. And umami is a key flavor for sake. Sake has 7 to 10 times the amino acid profile of wine. So we're much more likely to pick up on umami or savory flavors in sake than we are in wine. So this is a wonderful medium-bodied sake, has much more heft to it than the Honjozo, but a very deep and complex flavor compared to our more simple, crisp, and clean Honjozo. Now, moving on to our final sake in the tasting, this is Yamaguchi Shuzojo. So this is the brewery, Yamaguchi Shuzojo. And this is in Fukuoka. So this is in the far west of Japan on Kyushu Island. And let's take a look at this sake. So this is Niwa no Uguisu 50 Jumai Daigenjo. So Niwa no Uguisu, it's a little bit of a tongue twister, but that is the brand name for this sake, and it means Nightingale's Garden. So that is the meaning of it, and the 50 represents the rice milling rate. So this is milled down to 50%, and this qualifies as a Jumai Daigenjo. So this is our super premium grade. So I'm going to go ahead and pour my sample number 3. Now the statistics for this one, this is, sorry, there's a mistake on the slide. This is a Jumai Daigenjo. The rice milling rate is 50%. SMV is +2. So this is a little bit closer to 0, not quite as dry as the previous two. And the alcohol percentage is 15%. The Koji rice, the rice to make the Koji component, is Yamada Nishiki. Now, Yamada Nishiki is considered the king of sake rice. It's the most widely used premium sake rice, and it's very often used for very premium styles of sake, and is known for giving more fruity airs to the sake. The kakemai, or the starch component rice, is Yume Ikkon. So let's go ahead and give this one a smell. Now you may notice less over ricey aromas and a little bit more of a fruity characteristic. And let's give it a taste. So you can tell with the 50% rice milling, the texture is very silky on the palate, very smooth. And as you mill the rice down to a smaller size, you're going to get more silky textures. The texture is really one of the things I think that really is reflected by the rice milling rate. So now that we have our 3 samples poured, you can feel free to taste back and forth. The big difference between these 3, the first one is our alcohol added style, and the other 2, this number 2 and number 3, are the pure rice style. And I think that the texture between them is one thing that will really help you pick out and understand the differences between the different grades. All right, so we're gonna talk very briefly about the sake production process. I just want to take a couple minutes and show you a few pictures and walk you through the production process very quickly. And then we're going to take some questions for the last 10 minutes or so. All right, so the sake production process. So we start with the rice milling. I showed you this machine earlier. This is the machine that polishes the rice down, and the smaller you go, the more premium the rice is going to be. After the rice has been milled, it has some powder left on it, so we actually need to wash the rice. That is me, by the way, right there in my uniform. I had a head-to-toe white uniform I had to wear for a whole year, so I looked very much like a marshmallow every day, but this is what I had to do. This is hand washing the rice, and then we want to soak the rice as well after that. And this introduces moisture into the grain and prepares it for steaming, which is the next step of the process. And here I am receiving the steamed rice out of the koshiki. Now the koshiki is the rice steamer, and my colleague is scooping the freshly steamed rice into the bucket. And I'm going to take this bucket to the area where the rice is cooled. It is too hot right at this moment. If we put yeast or koji onto this steaming rice, it would kill those microorganisms. So we need to cool it down first. So we bring it to a room where the rice is cooled. What we're actually doing here in this picture is throwing the rice back and forth on a sheet. So one person will lift up one end of the sheet and then the other person will, and we roll the rice back and forth. This aerates the grains and brings the temperature down quickly. After the rice is cooled, we need to make the koji rice. So that's the next step in the process. And here I am sprinkling the mold onto the freshly steamed rice. And again, this process takes about 48 hours to go from mold spores on the rice to the fully grown mold on the grain, the koji rice itself. After that and here's some shots that are available that show you the different processes. The bottom right picture here is actually the finished molded koji rice coming out of the koji room. This is a very, the temperature in the Koji room, by the way, is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Koji has to be watched 24 hours a day. So the only time I worked overnight was my internship working in the Koji room. It takes very dedicated craftsmen to make Koji. After Koji, we do the fermentation starter. This is the magic point where fermentation actually begins. What we're doing here is we're making a small batch of sake, and this is like a little place for the yeast colony to grow. The yeast arrives at the brewery. If you order if you order yeast from a supplier, it arrives in a little vial about the size of a chapstick, and you have to grow that yeast colony up, and we use this fermentation starter to do that. So what goes in here? We put in water, we put in all the yeast on the first day, we put in regular steamed sake rice, and we put in the Koji rice. And those 4 ingredients ferment for about 2 weeks. And this is just a preliminary ferment before we move to the main mash. And this grows a very robust, healthy yeast colony. Here's another shot of the yeast starter. And next, when this is done after 2 weeks, we move on to what's called Moromi, or the main mash. This is the main large tank, and we ferment in this tank for about 30 days. We add more water. We put the yeast starter in there first. The fermentation starter goes in. Then we add more water. We add more Koji rice, and we add more regular steamed rice. And once the tank gets filled up, then we ferment for about 30 days. And if you look down into the tank, this is what the main mash looks like. The color is almost, I call it like French vanilla ice cream color, and it bubbles away quite actively in the beginning. And the aromas can be very, very beautiful and very fruity and very lush. After the 30 days of fermentation, we need to separate the alcohol from the unfermented rice. And we do that in a machine like this. This is called the Yabuta press. And we pump the mash into the frames. Pressure is applied from the side, and then the liquid is forced out the bottom. When we open up the frames after the pressing process, we have sake kasu as a leftover byproduct. This is all the unfermented rice. And this is scraped out of the press, and it's actually packaged up and sold by most breweries. Sake kasu, or the leftover rice pressings from sake making, is an ingredient that you can buy in a Japanese supermarket. So this is used in cooking and all types of other applications. It's even used in cosmetics and things like that. So sake kasu is a very valuable byproduct of sake making. After the pressing, sake is aged and stored usually for about 6 months. And then we move on to our final step of bottling. And most sake is pasteurized twice during this process as well. All right, so that takes us to the Q&A. So Jay, I don't know if you want to lead the Q&A or if you want me to read the...
Why don't you read them, Timothy? I think I'm afraid I'll mispronounce something horribly.
All right. So I'm going to look in the chat and go ahead and answer any questions that I see here. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. Okay. Oh, this is a great question. So for sake number 1, the rice was milled to 55%. Why not label this a ginjo? That is a great question. And to answer that question, I'm actually going to, let's see if I can share my screen again. Okay. So that is an excellent question. All right, so if we go back to the chart, why is we have 2 sakes that are milled to 55%. For the alcohol added style, 55% could sell as a ginjo or a honjozo. So why does the brewery choose to sell it as a honjozo? Well, the reason for that is because this brewery makes a ginjo sake that's polished to 50% remaining. So they don't want 2 ginjos on the market, one at 50 and one at 55. They'd rather technically downgrade one of those sakes, the 55%, and sell it as a really, really awesome honjozo versus having 2 ginjos at just very close in rice milling range. So they want to provide a lot of value to the customer, so they mill to a ginjo quality, but they're selling it as a honjozo. And that's the reason that it's labeled also as a tokubetsu or special honjozo. I hope that makes sense. That can be true across the board. If you mill your sake to 50%, you're not required to sell it in the highest category you qualify for. You can downgrade yourself and sell it as a really, really good Junmai Ginjo instead of moving it to the Jumai Daigenjo. The reason that most breweries do that is because they already have a Jumai Ginjo, or they already have whatever grade, and they don't want two on the market kind of competing with each other. All right, so let's close this. Let's see if we can go to the next question.
Timothy, Caroline Herman has a question.
Yes.
You can read it in the chat box if you go down to her question.
Is it a new trend to use different rice varieties for koji versus sake? Are there some rice varieties that are better for koji? That is a great question as well. I wouldn't say it's a new trend. It's almost like the recipe is up to the brewer. So the brewer decides how many varieties of rice are going to be used. Sometimes they use one, sometimes they use two, one for the koji, one for the kakemai. Sometimes they use multiple kinds of rice, 3 or even 4. And the whole decision behind how many varieties to use, it's really up to the brewer. Now, I asked the brewer that I worked with, the master brewer, and I said, oh, you're using 2 rices to make this honjozo. Why are you choosing to use 2 instead of just staying with 1 variety? And the answer that I got, honestly, was, well, we tried a whole bunch of different options, and this is the one we liked best. So it really comes down to the choice of the master brewer. So I would not say this is a new trend. One thing to be aware of, though, is that the rice that they choose for the koji, I've heard from many brewers that the koji rice is usually the more expensive rice or the more premium rice, or they're more worried about the viability of the koji versus the starch component. So if they are going to invest in a very expensive premium sake rice, my experience has been more often that they would apply that to the koji rice versus the starch component. Okay, are there typical SMV levels for classical styles within each category? That's a great question. You can have SMV levels all over the place for the categories. The categories and the SMV are completely divorced from each other. Some people also ask me about cloudy sake or unpasteurized sake. Where does that fit on that chart? Those, again, are completely divorced from the classifications. The classifications that I introduced to you tonight, you can consider them like the foundation. And things like how dry or sweet the sake is, how cloudy or clear the sake is, how pasteurized the sake is, those are all things that are decided at the end, towards the end or the after fermentation. So the milling rate and the ingredients are decided before fermentation, and a lot of these things that affect the final product, I call them the styles versus the classifications. So the styles of how sweet or dry it might be, how much water gets added, how long it's aged, these are all post-fermentation considerations. So those are completely independent of the classifications I introduced tonight. So there's no typical SMV or dryness rating for different grades.
Timothy, the next question just plays really, we should probably address it first, which is from Calvin, which is, what is the SMB scale?
Yeah, I touched on this briefly in my remarks. The SMV is a measurement roughly of how sweet or dry the sake may be perceived. And it's really a measure of the density of the sake versus water. So 0 on the SMV scale is the same density as water. The plus numbers on the scale get increasingly less dense than water, and alcohol is less dense than water. So you get more kind of alcohol, pronounced alcohol presence, and you get a drier flavor. And the more sugar, the more residual glucose, that's sugar water is thicker than water. So as you go negative on the scale, below 0, there's more residual sugars generally left in the sake at that point. So you'll get generally a sweeter impression. So that's what this SMV scale is. I can tell you from my experience, the further you are away from 0, the more useful this number is to you. If you have one sake that's a -1 and one sake that's a +2, you may not notice a huge difference in that sake. But if you have a +12 or a -35, those sakes are more on the fringes of the scale, and you're going to notice a more pronounced impression and more useful use of that number.
Mr. Sullivan.
Yes.
Well, I was asking that question, like, what's the highest number? So does it go from 0 to 100, or is it 0 to 50? What's the actual scale? That was the question.
I can tell you what the actual lowest and highest numbers are for products that are for sale on the market. The highest SMB I've ever seen for a product that's for retail sale on the market is +21. So that would be considered a bone dry, super dry sake. And the lowest number I've ever seen is a -100. And that's for a super sweet yogurt style dessert sake that has strawberry flavoring in it. So it's very, very thick compared to water. So that's the practical range in the world. But most sakes are going to fall between like -5 and +5. That's generally the range where most sakes are going to be.
Timothy, Michael asks, can you give us some basics on serving sake as far as temperature, glassware, any tips on food pairing? Before you answer that, though, the SMV, is it always standard practice to put it on the label, or is that optional?
It's not standard practice to put it on the label. It is increasingly available. It's more of a measurement that brewers took for themselves to measure the density of the sake.
I see.
But it's morphed into a little bit of a marketing tool. If you have a super dry or a super sweet sake, some brewers put it on the label, some do as a matter of course, but it's not something you're guaranteed to see everywhere. So just a few words on serving sake. I hear from many people who come to seminars and events that they can't drink sake at home because they don't have a sake set at home. And unfortunately, I hate to break it to them, but you do not need a sake set to drink sake. You can drink sake out of anything you like. And I recommend a white wine glass. Everyone has one of those at home, and it's something you can use very easily to enjoy sake. The one thing I'll say about serving vessel for sake is that the more aromatic the sake is, the more you're likely going to want a glass with a bowl or some way to enhance that aromatic and to enjoy it. So a bowled vessel like a wine glass is something that is really recommended for the more aromatic sakes. If you have the dry, more ricey, more straightforward sakes that don't have those pronounced aromatics, you may see people enjoying those from the ochoko or the small sake cups that are, 3 or 4 sips each. Those are very common in Japan. And those are really meant generally for drier, less aromatic styles of sake. And there was a part of that question about food pairing. So the 3 styles that we had today, we had a dry and clean one. Actually, people may be surprised to hear this, but I very often recommend sushi and sashimi with dry, clean sakes. And the reason for that is this style of sake is very palate cleansing. So if you were to have different types of sushi, one bite, different types of fish, you really want to cleanse your palate between each of those bites. And a dry, clean, lighter style is magic for that. Now, this middle sake was more ricey, more depth of flavor, more complexity. And I recommend cooked dishes for this type of sake. You can think about things like nabe hot pot. So Japanese have this dish called nabe, which is like a stew or a hot pot. And that has really complex flavors and goes really, really well with this type of depth of flavor that you get with this more ricey, umami-driven sake. And the final sake was our lighter, very silky, more fruity, floral style of sake, the Jumai Daigenjo. And this sake can be enjoyed as an aperitif sometimes. Like if you want to have a light, very elegant, very, very fruity sake before you start your meal, that's a wonderful way to enjoy it. Otherwise, I recommend it with appetizers, such as your salad course or a steamed vegetable course or something that's a little bit lighter and crisper, pairs really well with that generally. So those are my food recommendations for these 3 sakes that we tried.
Timothy, also just one last aspect of that, Michael's question. He asked about temperatures.
Yes, so Serving temperature, we could spend a whole nother hour and a half talking about serving temperature. The ability to serve sake warm, room temperature, or chilled is one aspect of sake that other beverages generally do not have. The sakes that are best served warm, and this is my 3-second rule of thumb for when to warm or chill a sake. You want to look at that aroma. So if you have an aroma that is fruity or floral, or an aroma in any way that you want to preserve or enhance, those sakes we recommend serving chilled. When you chill that sake, you're going to help preserve those aroma compounds. When you warm up a sake, the more delicate fruit and floral driven aroma compounds evaporate off very quickly, and you're left with more of the ricey, robust aromas and flavors, and it brings the alcohol flavor a little bit more forward. So sakes that are dry, a little bit ricey, more robust, those are what we generally recommend for serving warm. So my quick tip is to smell the sake. If you want to preserve or enhance that aroma, serve it chilled. Otherwise, you can consider serving it warm.
Yuki asks, is it true that you cannot eat natto or other fermented food when you engage in sake brewing?
So natto is a very stinky fermented Japanese soybean dish. And the rule is you're not supposed to eat natto, this fermented food, before you go into a sake brewery. And that is very much true. The microbes that ferment the natto, the soybeans, can interfere with sake fermentation. So if you were to bring these microbes into a brewery, you could theoretically contaminate the fermentation of the sake mash. So brewers generally are told to avoid eating and coming in contact with this natto dish. I lived in Japan for a year, and I actually hate natto anyway, because it's very pungent, very smelly, very slimy, and it was not my favorite Japanese food I've ever come across. So it was very easy for me to avoid natto, but the brewers do not eat natto. And there's another dish, actually. Mikan is a type of orange, and if you get mikan oil under your nails, that can also act as something that would kill different microbes as well. So you're not supposed to eat these mikan oranges, and you're not supposed to eat natto when you're working in the brewery.
So Timothy, here's a question from Maxwell Park. I assume this is Nikki or Brent. This is, can you recommend a few other high quality Honjozo sakes that we might be able to find here in this market?
You know, I'm actually based in New York, so I'm not as familiar what you have available in the DC market. But I recommend going to an online supplier. There's one in DC, dcsake.com, and you can search by category and you can see what Honjozos they offer. Anything they're going to carry in their portfolio is going to be high quality and premium sake. So you definitely can't go wrong. Honjozo is one of the styles of sake where there is not as much variety as the Junmai styles. So your options will be a little bit more limited, but it's definitely worth seeking out some other styles of Honjozo.
Yeah, and so Carl asks, in general, how is sparkling sake produced?
Quickly, there's only two ways to make sparkling sake. One is to do CO2 injection. Like you're making seltzer or cola, under pressure, you force the CO2 into the liquid. And I've been to breweries that do this, and the machine, the tank that forces the pressure in looks like a nuclear turbine or something like that. It's got all these rivets on it and is under pressure, and they actually force the CO2 into the sake, and then it gets bottled immediately after that. Premium sparkling sake is made using the champagne or the traditional method, where you do a secondary in-bottle fermentation, and the bottles get riddled, disgorged, and corked. So there's a process that's very similar to sparkling wine that we do with sake as well. What we use instead of sugar and yeast to make the secondary fermentation is we take some live Moromi mash. So some of that mash from the main tank goes into a bottle with some finished premium sake, and that gets sealed up. The secondary fermentation is only 2 months though with sake. So we do the traditional method or we do the CO2 injection.
The next question comes from is sake quality more centered around geography or producer? In other words, does sake from one prefecture, is it considered better than another, or are certain producers always considered better than another?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a very high quality sake produced all over the country. So I wouldn't say that there are regions that produce higher quality sake than others. There are regions that have more of the industry concentrated in them. Niigata is the #1 prefecture as far as number of sake breweries. Hyogo and Kyoto are two other prefectures that produce large volumes of sake. They have major producers in those regions. But there is sake produced in every single prefecture in Japan, but some prefectures only have one sake brewery. So there's a wide range of availability, but quality is good across the country. You are going to notice regional styles based on the water source, the type of water that is local. And we talked about that earlier, the hard water versus the soft water.
And Counselor Kuroishi asks, how do you evaluate the potential of pairing between sake and Western food? And do you have some suggested or recommended pairings?
Yes, actually, I've come to learn over time that there are analogs to many Japanese foods and flavors in the Western world. For example, if you look at my favorite dish in Japan, my favorite Japanese food is yakitori. Yakitori is charcoal grilled chicken on a stick. And it's not too far of a leap to go from charcoal grilled chicken in Japan to charcoal grilled chicken, rotisserie chicken here in the States. So you have similar flavor profiles, and you can find this again and again and again through different things. You know, if you have sashimi in Japan, you can have ceviche elsewhere in the world. And there's analogs that you can look to when you're pairing sake with Japanese food and sake with Western food. I will say one thing though, I mentioned this earlier, the two things to be aware of when you're pairing sake with non-Japanese food. One is that sake has about 1/3 of the acidity of wine. So if you're used to pairing wine and food, wine and Western food, the acidity profile in sake is much, much, much lower. So you're going to get a softer edge when it comes to pairing. You're not going to get acidity to stand up to the pairing. So you may think like all is lost, what are we going to do? But sake has a superpower that wine does not have. And I mentioned this earlier about the amino acid profile. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and protein gives us the flavor profile umami, which is the center, the core of Japanese cuisine. If you think about soy sauce or miso or shiitake mushrooms, these umami flavors are central and core to Japanese cuisine, and sake is built from the ground up to pair beautifully with these umami-driven flavors. The good news is that there is umami in the cuisines of the world. Tomato sauce has lots of umami. Parmesan cheese has lots of umami. Of course, all the meats of the world have lots of umami. So you can use umami as a starting point for pairing sake and Western food. I find that there's very little you can do wrong. That can be our little secret, that there's very, very little you can do wrong when it comes to pairing sake and food. You may have some that may not be ideal, but you're never going to get those clashes where it's like absolutely horrible and you've gone way off the tracks. So there's less margin for error when it comes to pairing sake and food in general.
Peter asks, my understanding is that there is no legal definition of handmade sake. How is this? Or microbrewery, often differentiated on a label? And are there many sake breweries operating in Japan, like microbreweries in the US?
Yeah, so the system they've set up in Japan is a little bit different from what we have here in the States. You need a license to brew sake, and home brewing is illegal. So you cannot set up a tank in your garage and start making your own sake. That is against the law in Japan, and you need a brewing license to produce sake, fermented alcohol. Because of this, many breweries have many, many, many years of tradition. The brewing license is handed down, and many breweries have long multi-generational histories. The requirement is that you produce sake every year, but they don't specify the amount. Some breweries are run by one person or a father and son, and they produce, a few tanks a year, and other breweries produce thousands and thousands of tanks a season. So it varies very widely, and it is up to the individual producer how much they want to produce. But they have to produce something or else they might lose their brewing license. And again, home brewers, if you're not in the industry, you have no chance to get your feet wet and start brewing at home. That's just not allowed in Japan.
Wow. Our last question, actually, several people asked, well, I see a new question, but we've got questions about, can you age sake, and does it get better by aging?
Yeah, generally, sake is not meant to be aged. Sake is like a relative of beer in that way that, most sake is not meant to be aged. Sake generally tastes better fresh, and it's meant to be consumed within a year after it's bottled and shipped from the brewery. But there are exceptions to that. About 1% of sake made in Japan is aged on purpose. That's called koshu, or aged sake. And generally, the accepted aging is 3 years or longer. Aged sake is having a real renaissance or a real moment recently. And I think in the future, we're going to see even more premium aged sake. The big difference between aged sake now and in the past is the temperature of the aging. Brewers have discovered that if they age sake at a very low temperature, freezing or below, sake will not change color, and you can get the deepening of the flavor without any of the oxidation to the sake. And you can produce very complex, rich, and very delicious, elegant sakes. Sakes that are aged for 3 years or longer at room temperature tend to turn very nutty and sherry-like. So it's a stylistic difference, and I think as time goes by, more and more brewers are now experimenting with aging at low temperature. So I think we'll see an emerging category over time of these super premium, very elegant aged sakes.
Our last question is, does anybody distill sake? And if so, what is it called?
Yes, distilled sake is called shochu. So shochu is the native distilled alcohol in Japan. You can basically take any fermented base and you can distill it. And in Japan, that's called shochu. So you can take sake and distill it and get shochu. You can make shochu from barley, from rice, from different starches, and get shochu. So that's the distillate. The shochu in Japan is about 25 to 30% alcohol. And many, many things are distilled and converted into shochu, but rice is one of them.
Fantastic. Well, Timothy, thank you so much. That was really informative. I learned quite a bit. And I want to thank the Embassy of Japan for sponsoring this seminar. And I'd also like to thank Counselor Kuroishi for joining us, and it was wonderful to have you. Also, Miwa and Caroline, thank you for all the hard work, in organizing this. I want to just say that we do have some other events coming up on January 21st. And these are all posted on the Capital Wine School website as of this morning. On January 21st, we'll have a wonderful seminar on Shochu presented by Stephen Lyman and Christopher Pellegrini. February 4th, Caroline and I will be doing a sake presentation. Caroline's the expert, but we're going to be talking about the differences and similarities between sake and wine. I'll be focusing on the wine part, you can bet. On February 8th, we've got a seminar on the terroir of sake with John Gontner, excuse me, I'm butchering his name. And then March 4th, a class on Japanese whiskey, and that's with Brian Ashcroft. And finally, on March 18th, we have accessible sake with Sarah Gunnerbach. She used to work for RNDC and was here in this market for many years. And I think she's in North Carolina now. But she also says sake is not just for sushi anymore. So lots of great classes coming up. They're all free. Just register on our website. We'll be sending out newsletters as well. But again, I want to thank Timothy. Fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed hearing you speak, and you'll have to tell me how to get one of those scholarships to go learn how to brew in Japan.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.